So the head is the most likely to sustain a serious injury as a result of a motorcycle collision. And that's because when a motorcyclist is ejected, they tend to lead with their head. So if their path is intersected by another vehicle, then they may go head first into that other vehicle. Or if they're ejected from the motorcycle, the head is always a part of the body that makes contact either with the ground or with another fixed object, like some kind of like a tree or some other barrier. So while there are other injuries like broken legs, broken arms, broken ribs, protecting the head is particularly important because if we think of it in terms of the brain inside of the head is the computer that runs the body, it's important to protect that computer. If that gets damaged, then it can cause all kinds of other problems, including, fatal injuries. So the work that I have been doing goes beyond what the current motorcycle helmet standards evaluate. And while there has been some progress recently in the development or revision of these standards, particularly the ECE standard for use in Europe, the new 2206 standard, the FIM standard, which is the Fédération Internationale de Motorcycle, or in English, the International Motorcycle Federation, which governs motorcycle helmets for competition use, and the new voluntary Snell standard in the United States that will be released next year, the 2025 revision. They're all now beginning to look at brain injury risk, which is very encouraging. The research that I've been doing in this field, and in particular on motorcycle helmets over the past 10 years, has done a comprehensive evaluation, not only of the risk of head injuries, but also the risk of brain injuries. And the main finding is that standard motorcycle helmets, and I mean certified helmets, those that are intended to be used as a true motorcycle helmet, they offer no protection against these brain injuries. In fact, the helmets can actually increase the risk of rotational brain injuries due to the fact that the helmets are bigger and heavier than the head alone. So far, I have tested a selection of 30 different helmet models. And for each of those 30 helmet models, I have purchased several, perhaps in some cases 5 or more samples of each helmet for my independent testing. The helmets include full face or full coverage helmets. They include the open face helmet, which is the one without the chin bar, and sometimes referred to as a jet helmet or a 3/4 helmet. I've also tested a lot of the half shell or shorty helmets, as well as 5 different models of novelty or non-certified helmets. While those tend not to be used in any of the other regions of the world, they are used somewhat commonly by what we'll call rebel riders in the United States, people who are wearing a helmet, although the helmet does not meet testing standards. So I've tested 30 different helmet models, and I have compared these against an unhelmeted head impact. Actually, I've performed 70 unhelmeted head impacts in different regions, impacts to the front of the head, impacts to the back of the head, different impact speeds. So that I use as a baseline to measure the risk of head and brain injury in an unhelmeted or unprotected condition. The helmets are then tested in a similar manner, and I have 3 different test apparatuses that I use. The first is a guided twin wire drop system, which is the same as typically used in most motorcycle helmet standards, as well as standards for other sports and different applications. So we have twin wires, if you will, and those wires guide the helmet as it falls from a height. The height may be 2 or 3 meters. So at the impact, when the helmet impacts the ground, in this case, it's a steel anvil or a concrete base that I impact. At that point of impact, the helmet is traveling between 6 meters per second and 7.5 meters per second. So that's about 13 to 18 miles per hour. I then have also a what I call an inverted pendulum apparatus, where the pendulum is anchored and falls through 90 degrees with the helmet on a head and neck at the end. So it falls. Because it's falling through an arc, it generates a higher speed, higher impact speed than if it simply fell through a linear motion. So it allows me to test a higher impact speed from a similar fall height. So with that apparatus, I'm able to achieve up to 20 miles per hour, which is about 8.5 meters per second. And then secondly, lastly, I have a twin pendulum apparatus where, if you imagine if you have 2 pendulums and they come together, like so, it's like each part is moving at 20 miles per hour, or about 8.5 meters per second, and they collide in the middle, and they generate an impact speed of 17 meters per second, or about 40 miles per hour. So that is a very high impact speed that I'm able to generate with that apparatus. I'm using a crash test dummy head, which is a hybrid 3 head form with the hybrid 3 neck, so that it's able to move on the neck. And inside of the head are 5 different sensors that measure the linear and angular motion of the head in response to the impact. So we have to understand there are 2 different mechanisms that cause injury. We have translational forces and tangential forces. Now, translational forces are the forces that cause something to move in a direction. For example, if I take my phone, I apply a force against it. This is a linear force. It causes the phone to translate or move in a linear direction. You'll note that I'm impacting in the center of the phone. If I impact the phone obliquely, it will cause the phone to rotate. That generates a tangential force. So these linear forces that cause translation, those are the ones responsible for causing focal head and brain injuries. Those focal injuries include bruises, lacerations or cuts, skull fractures, as well as bruising to the brain, which is called a brain contusion. The rotational forces are the ones that cause concussions, damage to the nerves in the brain, and bleeding in the brain. So because they are very different types of forces, they are managed in different ways. Now, helmets are designed the same way that they have been for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that is to prevent penetrating injury to the head. So the same way that helmets were designed for medieval or even older military purposes to prevent like a sword or an axe from penetrating the head, that is the same underlying principle to the design of motorcycle helmets. And it's important because as we're traveling at speed, there is a risk that if we come off the motorcycle, we may hit something that can break the skull and cause damage to the brain that way. So that's an important part to it. Those are the focal injuries. However, helmets have not, at least until very recently, started to address the risk of these brain injuries. Now, research has shown, I'm talking about epidemiological research, that's the research that uses statistics to understand how crashes happen and what the outcomes of different crashes are. These studies have shown that in 2/3 of all helmeted motorcycle head injury cases, 2/3 of them involve this rotational injury to the brain and resulting in fatal injury. Now, that's only because helmets have already done a great job of mitigating or reducing the risk of these focal head injuries. So we've got that part worked out. But now we have to focus on the other part, which is now the leading cause of brain injury. If it weren't for the helmet, the focal head injuries would cause serious injury and death. But we've got that part figured out. Now we need to figure out the rotational part. In my opinion, and based upon the research that I've been doing, helmets do such a great job of reducing these focal injuries. They've actually been over-engineered to reduce these focal injuries that we now have these huge helmets that are heavy. They can weigh up to 2 kilograms or 4 pounds on the head. And because of that extra size and weight, it causes rotational inertia. And the brain inside of the head, once the head stops moving, the brain is still moving. That's what causes the damage to the nerves and the blood vessels that cause these fatal injuries. So, in my opinion, and based on my research, because the helmets have been so over-engineered, they're now too big and too heavy. And my research shows that smaller, lighter helmets will actually do a better job of reducing the rotational brain injuries and yet can still provide excellent protection against these focal brain injuries. The standard liner that is in a motorcycle helmet is made from expanded polystyrene, which is a very cheap, very lightweight material. And it was the material that was listed in the original patents that are more than 60 years old. That material does a good job of reducing these focal injuries, but doesn't do anything to prevent rotational brain injuries. In fact, as I mentioned, it can make rotational brain injuries worse because the helmet is so much larger and heavier. There are new materials or new methods new methods that are being now used to, what's the right word? To disengage the helmet from the head. So the helmet can move independent of the head. So there are some technologies developed in Europe. One is called the multi-directional impact protection system that does show some improvement in reducing these rotational forces. There are also some technologies that have been developed in the United States, such as the omnidirectional protection system that, in my opinion, works better in sort of disassociating or separating the shell of the helmet from the head of the person, of the rider, so that they can move independently. In my opinion, if there are technologies that are incorporated into helmets, then in order to minimize the size and the weight of the helmet, those technologies should only be used for head and brain injury protection. What I mean by that is there are other technologies such as Bluetooth and sunshades integrated into the helmet. And while they may have feature benefits to the rider, they're not protective benefits to the rider, but they're adding to the size and the weight of the helmet. So, in my opinion, those should be avoided. If a rider wants to wear sunglasses or add some kind of Bluetooth technology, they can choose to do that if they wish, but anything that adds to the size and weight of the helmet will increase the risk of brain injury. My research has not only looked at motorcycle helmets, but has looked at helmets from many other realms. So I've studied helmets for American football. I've studied skiing helmets, bicycle helmets, ice hockey, mountain bike, military, studied many, many different types of helmets. And overall, I've performed over 2,500 impact tests. So with this wealth of information, I can see a trend, and that is the smaller, lighter helmets provide excellent protection against the focal injuries that are caused by translational forces, the linear forces I talked about. So even though they're smaller and lighter, at similar impact speeds to those I've performed on the motorcycle helmets, they still provide excellent protection. But because they're smaller and lighter, they're also reducing the risk of rotational brain injuries. So from what I'm seeing, the best helmet for motorcycling may not currently be a motorcycle helmet. So I'm seeing excellent performance from, for example, bicycle helmets and mountain bike helmets. And if you imagine, bicyclists could be traveling 40 miles per hour or 20-something kilometers per hour. That's certainly not unheard of. And yet their helmets are designed to protect them. Now, there are differences in standards. I don't really understand the differences. Like bicycle helmets have spacing between the ribs that allow for ventilation. Motorcycle helmets are required to be a complete shell that prevents any kind of penetrating injury from any direction. So because of that difference, bicycle helmets are able to be much lighter. So based on the research that I've been doing, we may be able to move in the direction of like bicycle style helmets that will provide excellent protection as well as excellent ventilation. Now, that depends on which area of the world that you may be riding in. If you're riding in Africa or Central America, then you may want ventilation from the heat. But if you're in the United Kingdom, then you may want the helmet to help keep you warm. So I guess to get back to your question, what does the future helmet look like? The future helmet, in my opinion, will be smaller and lighter, and thereby be more comfortable, because it's going to be creating less drag from wind resistance and less weight on the person's neck that can cause fatigue. So smaller, lighter helmets, I think, will serve the protective purposes well, but also be more comfortable in that manner. Obviously, the serious injuries are the result of a collision or a crash. Collisions typically involve another vehicle on the road, or they could be caused by a solo motorcycle crash where there's no other vehicle involved, but perhaps the rider runs wide in a corner, and that actually tends to be the number one cause of fatal injuries in motorcyclists. It's running wide in a corner, because they tend then to strike fixed objects that are very unforgiving, like trees or barriers. So to reduce the risks of those types of collisions and crashes, there are a couple of things that can be done. Number one is to improve our ability as motorcycle riders through advanced training. It's been shown that there are certain key factors that cause these types of collisions and resulting injuries. Those factors being lack of training or lack of advanced training. And we'll get a little bit more into training in a minute. So we've got the training aspect, we've got the helmet issue, which, in the United States, there are a number of states where helmet use is a voluntary aspect. In other words, it's up to the rider whether they choose to wear a helmet or not. So helmet use, alcohol or other forms of impairment lead to crashes, and speed. Those are the four key factors: speed, impairment, helmets, and training. Now, I know that in European countries, the training requirements are much more stringent. In the United States, the initial training is I would say, minimal. Persons who are interested in learning to ride motorcycles, they go to a weekend-long class and they practice on small motorcycles in a parking lot or car park at relatively low speeds. They can then go out and buy the biggest motorcycle in any dealership they want and ride, but they have no experience with riding at speeds, particularly like highway speeds, where the skills that we need to use are very different from the skills that we use in a car park. So training is critical. In my opinion, getting that motorcycle license is only the first step in learning how to ride a motorcycle. It's then important that the motorcyclist take additional training and advanced training and always practice and improve upon their skills.